Number 8. The Charge of the Light Brigade. On October 25th, 1854, during the Battle of Balaclava in the Crimean War, 670 British cavalrymen received an order that would become synonymous with military incompetence. Due to a vaguely worded command and a dismissive hand gesture from a staff officer, the Light Brigade was directed to charge directly into a valley surrounded on 3 sides by Russian artillery. Their actual objective had been a different set of guns entirely. The cavalrymen knew the order was suicidal. Lord Cardigan, who led the charge, reportedly protested before obeying anyway. For 20 minutes, the Light Brigade rode through what became known as the Valley of Death, Russian cannons tearing into them from the front and both flanks simultaneously. Horses and men were shredded by grape shot and shell. Those who reached the Russian guns engaged in brief, desperate combat before being forced to retreat back through the same killing field. Of the 670 men who began the charge, 278 were killed or wounded. 375 horses were destroyed. The entire action achieved nothing of strategic value whatsoever. The Russians watching from the hills were so bewildered by the charge that one officer reportedly said the British must be drunk. The disaster was immortalized in Tennyson's poem, but the glory it assigned masked the horror of what actually occurred. Young men torn apart because one officer couldn't write clear orders and another was too proud to question them. How many military catastrophes throughout history have begun with those same ingredients of ambiguity and ego? Number 7. The Gallipoli Campaign. In 1915, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, conceived a plan that would cost over 470,000 casualties and achieve absolutely nothing. The idea was deceptively simple. Force the Dardanelles Strait, capture Constantinople, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and open a supply route to Russia. On paper, it would shorten World War I by years. In reality, it became an 8-month nightmare of incompetence, disease, and slaughter. The naval assault failed when mines and shore batteries destroyed or damaged a third of the Allied fleet. Rather than abandoning the campaign, commanders doubled down, landing troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula in April 1915. The Ottoman defenders, led by Mustafa Kemal, the future Ataturk, were waiting. The beaches became death traps. At Anzac Cove, Australian and New Zealand forces found themselves pinned against cliffs, unable to advance against entrenched machine guns. At Cape Helles, British troops waded through water turned red with blood. The summer brought dysentery and flies that blackened the corpses too numerous to bury. Temperatures soared while men fought over yards of scrubland. When the Allies finally evacuated in January 1916, they had suffered 302,000 casualties, including 46,000 dead. The Ottomans lost over 250,000. The only successful part of the entire operation was the evacuation itself. Churchill's political career was temporarily destroyed. The disaster shaped Australian and New Zealand national identity through shared trauma. One man's strategic gamble had fed 500,000 soldiers into a meat grinder that moved nothing but the casualty lists. Number 6. The Fall of Singapore. On February 15th, 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered Singapore to Japanese forces, handing over 80,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops in what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. The fortress that was supposed to be impregnable had fallen in just 1 week. The catastrophe was years in the making. Despite Singapore's reputation as a bastion of imperial defense, its famous coastal guns pointed seaward, useless against an attack from the Malayan jungle to the north. Military planners had dismissed such an approach as impossible. The Japanese proved them catastrophically wrong. General Tomoyuki Yamashita's forces moved through Malaya with terrifying speed, using bicycles to navigate jungle paths that British commanders had deemed impassable. When they reached Singapore, they were actually outnumbered more than 2-1. Yamashita was nearly out of ammunition. But Percival, convinced he faced overwhelming force and fearing a massacre of civilians, chose surrender. The 80,000 captured soldiers entered a captivity that would kill roughly 1 in 4 of them. They were marched to Changi Prison and the construction sites of the Burma Railway, where tropical disease, starvation, and brutality awaited. The surrender shattered the myth of European invincibility in Asia, accelerating the end of colonial empires across the continent. How does an army twice the size of its enemy, defending prepared positions, surrender within a week? The answer lies in assumptions that went untested until the moment they collapsed. Number 5. The retreat from Kabul. In January 1842, the British garrison in Kabul, Afghanistan, began a retreat that would become one of the most complete military annihilations in history. Of approximately 16,500 people who left the city, including 4,500 soldiers and 12,000 camp followers, exactly 1 European is confirmed to have reached safety: Assistant Surgeon William Bryden, who arrived at Jalalabad on a dying horse. The disaster began with imperial overconfidence. The British had invaded Afghanistan in 1839 to install a puppet ruler, then garrison Kabul with inadequate forces in an impossible defensive position. When Afghan tribes rose against them, the British commander, the aging and indecisive General William Elphinstone, negotiated a withdrawal under promised safe conduct. The promise was worthless. As the column moved through mountain passes in freezing January temperatures, Afghan fighters attacked continuously from the heights. The column stretched for miles, hopelessly vulnerable. Soldiers froze to death at night. Camp followers, including women and children, were slaughtered or captured. At the Gandamak Pass, the remnants of the 44th Regiment of Foot made a last stand on a hilltop, fighting until their ammunition was exhausted, then fighting with bayonets and swords until they were overwhelmed. The Afghans had a saying, "Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires." The 1,842 retreat demonstrated why with brutal clarity. Nearly 2 centuries later, different armies would learn the same lesson in the same mountains, as if the landscape itself rejected foreign occupation. Number 4. The Battle of Cannae. On August 2nd, 216 BC, the Roman Republic suffered the single deadliest day in its military history. Near the town of Cannae in southern Italy, the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca executed a tactical masterpiece that killed between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers in approximately 9 hours of fighting. To put that in perspective, it exceeds the first-day casualties of the Battle of the Somme, achieved with swords and spears rather than machine guns. The Romans had assembled the largest army in their history, approximately 86,000 men, specifically to crush Hannibal through overwhelming force. They deployed in a dense, deep formation designed to smash through the center of the Carthaginian line. It was exactly what Hannibal wanted. As the Romans pushed forward, Hannibal's center deliberately gave ground, bowing inward but never breaking. Meanwhile, his cavalry destroyed the Roman horsemen on both flanks, then swept around behind the Roman infantry. Simultaneously, Hannibal's African infantry on the wings pivoted inward. The Romans suddenly found themselves completely encircled. What followed was systematic slaughter. Packed so tightly they could barely raise their weapons, the Romans were killed in a shrinking circle of death. Hannibal's men worked methodically through the mass of trapped soldiers for hours. Roman bodies were found with their heads buried in the earth, having apparently dug holes to suffocate themselves rather than await the sword. Cannae became the textbook example of the double envelopment, studied in military academies for over 2,000 years. Generals from Napoleon to Schwarzkopf have attempted to recreate it. Few have succeeded. None have matched its terrible efficiency. Number 3. Operation Barbarossa's Winter. In June 1941, Adolf Hitler launched the largest military invasion in history. Over 3 million German soldiers poured into the Soviet Union, expecting victory before winter. 6 months later, those same soldiers were freezing to death in their summer uniforms, their weapons jamming, their vehicles immobilized, as temperatures plunged to minus 40 degrees. The Wehrmacht had planned for a short campaign. Supply lines stretched over 1,000 miles across roads that turned to mud in autumn and ice in winter. German logistics never recovered. Soldiers received frostbite treatment instructions instead of winter clothing. Vehicle engines had to be kept running continuously, or they would never start again. Weapons froze solid. The Soviets, meanwhile, brought in fresh divisions from Siberia, troops equipped and trained for winter warfare. In December 1941, they launched a counteroffensive that pushed the Germans back from Moscow. For the first time, the Wehrmacht's advance halted. The human cost was staggering. By the end of the first winter, German forces had suffered over 900,000 casualties, roughly a quarter of their invasion force. Soviet losses were even higher, with millions of soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. The frozen plains became a mass grave. Hitler had made the same mistake as Napoleon 129 years earlier, assuming Russia could be defeated before winter arrived. The Russian winter, that ancient ally of Moscow, had once again destroyed an invading army. Yet unlike Napoleon, Hitler would refuse to retreat, condemning millions more to die in the years that followed. Number 2. The first day of the Somme. On July 1st, 1916, the British Army suffered the worst single day in its entire history. In the first hour of the Battle of the Somme, nearly 30,000 British soldiers fell. By sunset, the casualties reached 57,470, including 19,240 dead. Many battalions simply ceased to exist. The Newfoundland Regiment went over the top with 801 men and suffered 710 casualties in 30 minutes. The disaster was preceded by optimism. British commanders had bombarded German positions for 7 days with over 1.5 million shells. They assured the infantry that nothing could have survived. Soldiers were told they would simply walk across no man's land and occupy empty trenches. The bombardment had failed. German dugouts, some 30 feet underground, had protected the defenders. When the shelling stopped, German machine gunners emerged and found the British infantry advancing in neat lines, weighted down with 70 pounds of equipment, moving at walking pace across open ground. What followed was mechanical slaughter. Machine guns swept across the advancing waves with metronomic efficiency. Men fell in rows so regular they appeared to have been arranged. Some units were annihilated before traveling 10 yards. Others reached the German wire only to find it uncut, trapping them in killing zones. The battle would continue for 4 more months, ultimately producing over 1 million casualties on both sides for an Allied advance of 6 miles. The first day of the Somme revealed the horrifying mathematics of industrial warfare. Human courage counted for nothing against massed machine guns and artillery. Number 1. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. In June 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte crossed into Russia with approximately 685,000 soldiers, the largest army Europe had ever seen. 6 months later, fewer than 100,000 stumbled back across the border. The rest, nearly 600,000 men, had perished from battle, disease, starvation, and cold in the most catastrophic military campaign in modern history. The invasion was doomed by its own scale. Napoleon's supply lines could not sustain such a massive force across Russia's vast distances. The Russians, rather than offering the decisive battle Napoleon sought, retreated continuously, burning crops and villages as they went. When the French finally reached Moscow in September, they found the city empty and ablaze. Napoleon waited 5 weeks for a surrender that never came. When he finally ordered a retreat, winter was already closing in. The Grande Armée had no winter clothing. Horses died by the thousands, leaving artillery and supply wagons abandoned. Cossack raiders picked off stragglers. The temperature dropped to -30. The crossing of the Berezina River became a vision of hell. French engineers stood in freezing water for hours to build bridges while Russian artillery bombarded the crossing. Thousands drowned or were crushed in the panic. The river ran with bodies. When the survivors reached safety, they were unrecognizable as soldiers. Entire corps had vanished. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite, had been reduced to a few thousand walking skeletons. Europe's greatest military genius had destroyed his own army more completely than any enemy ever had. The frozen corpses stretched across 1,000 miles of Russian soil.